Hello and welcome to another Hand Drink Solo wine info video where we review curious wines for curious minds. And today's curious wine is a bottling that we haven't really spoken about for about 2 years, but it is such an important wine that we are circling back in order to cover it again. And that wine of the day is the Vine Venom Silence, which is a non-vintage Flor-aged Chenin Blanc made by the ever-inventive winemaker Samantha Suddens. Now, before we plunge into the new version of the Vine Venom Silence, I'm going to save you from all manner of deja vu. So instead of repeating a lot of the things that I talked about in the last video, I'm just going to leave a link to that video at the end of this one. If any sort of spazzing out on yeast or fermentation mechanics is your scene, then that video will excite you more than Pikachu at a puffin sale. In that video, we dive into what Flor actually is and how Saccharomyces cerevisiae kind of mutates into this surface-dwelling carpet-like alien. We also touch on a little bit of info about autolysis and glycerol consumption. But today we're going to do something a little bit different because as I was considering just how complicated this wine is and how tricky it is to make, I began wondering how you even begin to conceive of a wine like this in the first place. Rather than trying to make up the answer myself, I simply got hold of Samantha Suddens and asked her to share her thoughts. Of course, whenever you ask a winemaker a question like that, you can get all sorts of platitudes that range from, oh, I just put in the bottle what the vineyard gives me, or as we've gotten to know the vineyard better, the wine has really come into its own, almost as if some sort of an emotional connection to the vineyard improves your understanding of fermentation mechanics in the cellar. But instead of those platitudes, Samantha was kind enough to be really quite vulnerable and share how terrifying it can be to try and produce a wine like this. And she also tries to explain, at least to a certain extent, why she went to the crazy length to make this wine in the first place. The reason that I think this wine is so important to South African wine in general, and the reason I think it's worth covering more than once, is because it challenges a whole bunch of conceptions around the world, not only about Flor wines, but also about what Chenin Blanc can be in the bottle. For that reason alone, Samantha Suddens is delivering something that is both proudly South African and also a rare enough sensory experience that it can delight even the most seasoned wine drinkers or winemakers anywhere in the world. But rather than me share more of my thoughts about why it's important, I thought we'd get Samantha to share hers.
In a country that does Chenin Blanc so well, you can go every weekend and drink an amazing bottle of Chenin Blanc from across all of our regions. It could be sweet, it could be bubbly, it could be oaked, it could be mineral, it can be fruity. So for me, it was also like, well, what else is there? What else can we do here? How else can I explore this grape and how amazing it is? And what is the processes it can kind of go through?
Now, as I said, I wasn't going to go to the trouble of explaining what Flor is in this video because we did it in another video. But what I will say is that for all the most famous wine regions where Flor grows, like Jerez in Spain, for example, there is the unifying fact that they are all coastal regions. Now, this has nothing to do with the fact that there is magic salty sea air floating in, sent by the ocean fairies, but rather it has to do with climatic conditions that oceanic regions provide, and that is moderate temperatures with low temperature swings or low diurnal range. There's also very high humidity, and the fact that oceanic regions usually have much more stable barometric pressure. At this point, you may say, oh, but what about the Jura in France and the Vengeance of Jura? And I'd say largely that has to do with the fact that many of the old cellars are underground or at least semi-underground. And so you replicate those same conditions of very high humidity, very stable temperature or low temperature swings. And even there, the kind of Flor that develops in Jura is very different to the thick, glorious Flor that you would get in Jerez. But the point of all this is to say that the Swartland, which is a slightly more inland, very hot, dry area, is terrible for Flor growth. And so even the fact that Samantha is able to semi-regularly produce Flor wine in the Swartland is itself a peculiarity. So I got Samantha to share a few thoughts on how she actually goes about making this wine.
You know, I'm working naturally low intervention, so it does leave me a lot more vulnerable. The yeast is wild. It's the yeast that live there on the vineyard, on the grapes. The Flor is naturally occurring, so I leave headspace in the barrels to let the Flor naturally develop on the surface level of the wine. So that for me is an important factor because I'm not deciding to make a Flor wine. I'm not inoculating with a Flor yeast to decide, okay, I want this wine to taste like Flor. It takes about 6 to 8 weeks for the Flor to develop. But during this time, it leaves me quite vulnerable. The wine is in a natural state. It's going through malolactic. It's not temperature controlled, because if I temperature controlled the barrels, then the yeast wouldn't be at room temperature to be able to develop on the surface level of the wine. So this whole process, it's actually quite, I guess, stressful. It's not this kind of mechanical process where everything is given. I've had 2 barrels before where the Flor yeast has grown and broken up and dispersed and not reformed on top of those barrels. And because I'm passionate about showing Silence as being a Flor wine, I will not include those barrels or bottle those barrels in Silence. Silence is always 100% under Flor for the whole time of its existence, because I'm at the mercy of Mother Nature. I am working in this sort of vulnerable state, and anything can go in some sort of way as well.
Another reason that I love this wine is because it forces us wine nerds to really confront one of the contradictions that exists in almost every single bottle of wine that you drink. And that is the tension between winemakers expressing that really all they're trying to do is produce a wine that shows what the vineyard has given them, while at the same time making a number of decisions in the cellar, all of which will actually change how the wine tastes. So the question becomes, well, what defines the wine? Is it the vineyard, or is it the decisions that the winemaker makes? So for this particular wine, Samantha has sourced fruit from the exact same vineyard since the wine's inception, and she's never changed, and she loves this vineyard, and she chose it for a number of very specific reasons, as there is a certain character that a vineyard needs in order to produce the kind of grape juice that can successfully produce a delicious wine that has gone through all these wild biological Flor processes.
It was important for me to work with a vineyard that would suit this crazy process that I had in mind. I'd worked with this Chenin vineyard for 4 years before I'd started Vine Venom. So now a total of 8 years going on 9 years. So from the start of its life, Silence has been a single vineyard. Early on, I realized this would be suitable for this oxidative Flor Solera process. And what I saw was a vineyard that was vigorous. It's a trellis vineyard in the Swartland, Chenin Blanc, which is unusual because a lot of Chenin Blanc out here is bush vines. It's decomposed granite soils. I mean, the soils are like, beach sand. It is so soft, so light. And that vineyard doesn't struggle. So it means that it's just so mineral, fresh, lively. And to go through this kind of bashing that I put it through, oxidative barrel aging, underfloor aging, you really need a vineyard that is just like pristine from the day you pick those grapes.
So again, you see that tension pop up when you realize that she's chosen the vineyard very deliberately because she wants this site, but then also makes a number of decisions in the cellar which dramatically change what kind of wine comes out of that cellar. But then I suppose if you think about it for long enough, that's not really a contradiction or tension at all. It's actually more like a delightful synergy between vineyard and winemaker. But here's what Samantha had to say about it.
It really does go to show you need that quality from the vineyard first and foremost, but there's harmony between that vineyard, that grape, the Flor process and everything it goes to. And it's come out the other end being kind of what I had in my crazy mind.
Okay, so now that we've talked about the crazy process that this wine goes through in order to get into the bottle, let us get into the glass and actually see what this craziness tastes like. So when we give this guy a sniff, well, we get a lovely sort of spiced walnut and pear preserve. Perhaps you can use your imagination. That preserve has a touch of cinnamon in it, and it's spread over a thick, fresh slice of lazy sourdough. But then you also get a slightly, perhaps less familiar aroma for someone who drinks straight-laced wines all the time. And that is a slightly saltier, almost like sea air and oyster shell type element. Samantha has often called this a white wine for whiskey lovers and references something you might get from an Islay whiskey that has that kind of seaweed, kelp, sea air, iodine, salty, savory element to it. Islay, of course, being an oceanic region itself. And I suppose with all these oceanic maritime references being named, if this actually was a sherry produced under Flor from Jerez, which, as we know, is on the coast, as I mentioned earlier, then we probably would get all romantic and say something like, I can smell the influence of the ocean. There's definitely, as I said, magic sea salt air sent in by the ocean fairies. But we know that this is produced from a vineyard in the Swartland. It's nowhere near the ocean. which means we can at least dispense with this little slice of romance and understand that these amazing aromas and flavors come from that action of Flor in the wine. Now, when we give it a sip, well, the first thing you have to talk about really is a beautiful structure. It is such a fresh, lean laser acidity that runs down the middle, and then around that is an ever so slight, very gentle sort of chalky tannic tug on the wine. If you want to talk about what's arranged around that super tight core, it's probably a little bit of tart apricot, maybe a little bit of almond skin. In fact, I've said before sometimes that on this particular wine, it's a little bit like eating an apricot and then cracking the pip open and eating the apricot kernel in the middle, which is just like a little baby almond. Then, especially as the wine does warm a little bit, you get a more sort of sweeter stone fruit, white peach type element, a bit of nectarine. And then woven in between those are lovely salty elements like a salted lemon rind, but also fascinating flavors of almost caramelized, sliced, roasted pear, like you might get at a ridiculously fancy restaurant where they never feed you enough. And then the acidity that we mentioned at the beginning really does run down the full length of the wine. So towards the end, you are left with a lovely, juicy, citrus-like element almost. Maybe not citrus, maybe tart apricot, mouth-watering acidity, but it goes right through into the finish. And almost after you've swallowed the wine, don't take another sip too quickly, because you get the emergence of this really quite powerful, leesy, yeasty, sourdough type finish, which, to be honest, shouldn't be too much of a surprise, given that in this particular wine, yeast is almost more of a rock star than the vineyard or the winemaker. That's all we have time for today, but I am going to leave you links to 2 videos, one of which will talk about the previous version of the Vine Venom Silence. We'll go into detail about what Flor is and how it operates and even how it metabolizes alcohol and stuff like that. And the other one is another Vine Venom video talking about Samantha Suddens' Skin Chenin Blanc, probably her most critically acclaimed wine and a fantastic alternate expression of the same cultivar. So until next time, stay curious and always drink niche.